thank you. I understand that there's going to be a cocktail being served here in a brief second, but a little bit about myself. I'm the master blender for North America's largest distillery. I don't know if you realize that Canada has North America's largest beverage distillery, and it's located in Windsor, Ontario. I've been there now for 21 years. I always like to say whiskey keeps your youth. A lot of people, you've been there 21 years? Yes, I've been there for 21 years. I started out as the microbiologist. So I was the fellow that would look after the yeast for many, many years. And the company's been fantastic, where they spent and paid for 100% of my education. I had the opportunity to go to the University of Heriot Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland, where I did my Master's of Science in Brewing and Distilling. I'm a sucker for education, so I went on to further it, and I completed my PhD in Brewing and Distilling in 2012. So I'm one of two master blenders in the world that has a PhD in Brewing and Distilling, and we're located here in Canada. So with that, I don't know if the cocktail's going to come out. I'm going to skip over this slide here for a second, and we'll come back to Weisers Deluxe in a minute. I always like to start whiskey tastings with this regard is thinking about time, think about history, think about Canada. What do you think actually grew Canadian whiskey more than anything else? What helped it? Prohibition, yeah. I've probably did 400 whiskey tastings in the last 2 to 3 years, and that's the typical answer, is Prohibition. And quite frankly, I'm not to try to put you on the spot, Prohibition really killed the Canadian whiskey category. It did not help it whatsoever. So I'm going to lead you to what helped the Canadian whiskey category, and it is quite fascinating, as we do have a rich history of making whiskey in Canada. In actuality, the first instance of making whiskey in Canada was in Quebec City. Up to that point, Canadians would have likely drank rum. Being along the eastern seaboard and the influence with the British Navy, that's where all your sugar cane came out of the Caribbean, and Navy rum would have been drank at that time. But as Canadians moved into the interior, they still wanted to drink their booze. They still wanted alcohol, and what was accessible to them would have been grain and what was coming from the agriculture practice at that time. So a number of things happened to create a style of Canadian whiskey. And one of them was what we called was the Scottish Highland clearances, where we had a mass immigration of Scottish immigrants coming into Canada over a period of 100 years, from 1750 to 1850. And with that, they brought their little pot stills into Canada. The other big event in Canadian whiskey history was 1776. Does anybody recognize that year at all, 1776? The American, have we got some Americans in the audience? Yeah, American independence, right? Who did America fight during that war when they became independent? The British, yeah. Where'd the British go once they lost? Canada, yes. My family came in that. We're Empire Loyalists. That's what we called us at that time. We came into Canada, and they came up through the hills of New York, Ohio, Kentucky, Michigan, etc., bringing little pot stills. So by the time you hit 1830 in Canada, we had over 250 registered distillers making moonshine. That was the registered ones now making moonshine. Now, has anyone had an opportunity to try moonshine before? How was it? It was good? I see you sweating back there, yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah, I can see, that's a good thing. Well, that's the first time I've ever had that response, but yeah. Yeah, you've watched the moonshining show that's on what, A&E or whatever it is. But yeah, moonshine, for the most part, really has a really harsh, bitter taste. But that's what Canadians would have drank in the early 1830s, was a lot of this moonshine. So along comes a family. They're called the Gooderham and Worts family. I got them here in the bottom corner. They were part of the Highland clearances, and they came to Canada and settled in the Toronto area. So have you ever gone to the Toronto Distilling District in Toronto? That was the Gooderham and Worts distillery, and that's where they settled. Their intent to come to Canada was more about being millers. They milled grain for a living. They ground it into a flour so a farmer could resell it. And if you were a farmer and you brought it to the Gooderham and Worts milling company, you would bring your bushel of grain, bring it to the milling company. They would grind it into a fine flour for the farmer. Now, how transactions were done in that time period was the farmer would leave 10% of his grain with the miller, 90% would go back to the farmer for sale. So Gooderham and Worts started stockpiling all this grain. Well, what do you do with it all? Grain does not keep for very long periods of time. That's how they got into the whiskey business. Whiskey keeps better than grain. So they started making whiskey from it. But Gooderham and Worts fundamentally changed how whiskey was made. They invented a patent in 1846. It was actually designed after one of their engineers. It's called the Riley patent. And what they did was they double distilled through 2 long column stills. I'm going to show you some column stills here in a little bit. But what that did was made light style whiskey. It stripped out all those things in the moonshine that we did not like. So by the time he had 1870 in Canada, we went from 250 distillers to 15. And it was those guys that had the money and the capital and the wherewithal to make light style whiskey. That's why Canadian whiskey tends to be light and smooth. They double distilled it and they did what Gooderham and Worts originally designed. And if you actually go to see old photographs of the downtown Toronto, you'll see this windmill in the top right-hand corner. That was a 70-foot windmill they actually had on the waterfront at that point there. With that. Next guy I'll talk about. Henry Corby. Anybody recognize the name Corby? I hope so. The guys in the back better recognize Corby. Yes, Charles is waving his hand back there. So Henry Corby was indeed a distiller. He was part of the Scottish Highland clearances as well. And he came into Canada and he settled around the Belleville area. And his primary source of business or income was bread making. That's what he did for a living. But as a pioneer, you did lots of things. You owned lots of different businesses, and that's how they operated. They did many things. The other thing Henry Corby did to run his bread baking business was he'd operate a steamship. So you can see the steamship up in the top right-hand corner. And if you think about early Canadian life, we did not have our agriculture practices in play at this point, and we were still largely forestation. So what Henry would do is he'd take that steamship, sail across Lake Ontario, and import U.S. corn. I don't know if you realize it, but most Canadian whiskey is made of corn. It always has been. And we could see records even at our own Hiram Walker distillery showing they would import U.S. corn, making double distilled light whiskey at that time. Now, you got to appreciate the entrepreneurial spirit of a pioneer where they would actually do this, is that they would take every ounce of the property that they could and utilize it and grow grain for their distilleries. And you can see the Corby distillery here in front here. You can see a rye field in front of it. So what they would do is they would make and grow rye around their property, single distill it, and make a light rye whiskey, or a heavy rye whiskey. That's where blending came into play. Oh, thank you very much. I was getting parched.
So guys, dans celui-là, c'est du GP Weiser, sirop d'érable, lime et un pécho très spécial de Manuel.
Cheers. Cheers A, is like I to say in Canada. Cheers, yes. So building on that theme, rye is what could be grown in a Canadian climate. Rye is the DNA to Canadian whiskey, right? Rye is the heaviest of all the grains. So what they would do is make double distilled light corn whiskey, make a heavier rye whiskey, and make it and blend it together. I'll often do in whiskey tastings, I'll challenge an audience. If you were to order the dish, if you were to go to a restaurant and order the dish curry chicken, what's the main ingredient to the dish curry chicken? Chicken. I know it's a dumb question, isn't it? It's a dumb question. You'd be surprised how many people answer curry. But but the thing is, curry's the spice. Rye is the spice to Canadian whiskey. It's the DNA of what we do. Anybody drink Irish whiskey here? Yeah, so Irish whiskey does the same things as Canada will. Make a double distilled light corn whiskey, but they'll have barley as their ingredient. That's why Irish whiskeys tend to be nutty. If you drink blended scotches, you got that barley and that peated in there. That's why they tend to be smoky. Canada's rye. Rye actually won't grow past 25 degrees Celsius. It actually needs a cold climate, and that's why it's grown here in Canada. Hiram Walker. Does anybody recognize the name Hiram Walker? Yeah? I get some blank stares here. Usually outside of Windsor, people don't really recognize the name Hiram Walker anymore, which is too bad because he was one of the largest pioneers in Canadian whiskey culture. Is that Hiram Walker was an American. At the age of 22, he came to the city of Detroit. If you've actually been in the city of Windsor, Detroit, he settled where the big GM buildings are today, the General Motors buildings. That's where their center is today. And you can see his grocery store here. That's what he came to Detroit for, to run and operate his grocery store. And you can see it. If you actually blow up this picture here, you can see at Hiram Walker's grocery store, he was selling moonshine for 5 cents a gallon. Hell of a deal in the 1840s, yeah. I don't know what 5 cents would it be in translate today, but that's what he was selling it for. But I don't know what possessed Hiram Walker to do it, but he would take that moonshine, he'd buy it in from the farming communities, he'd run it through charcoal. Charcoal acts like the Brita. Do you have Brita water filters here? You know what I mean with the Brita water? So we'd strip out those impurities inside the moonshine, and I look at Hiram Walker maybe as one of the original blenders. I'm not saying he's the first blender, but he would blend those moonshines together and sell it out of his store, and he became quite good and profitable at it. He said, I want to expand my business. I want to get bigger. So he wanted to buy a distillery. Lo and behold, he bought a property. He looked south. After this today, get out your iPhone and look at Windsor, Ontario. We are south of the U.S. border there. We are south of the U.S. border. We're separated by the Detroit River, 800 meters. So he bought a property where we're located today 160 years ago for 1,300 pounds. It was 460 acres to start his distillery, and there were only 2 houses there. Today, there are 8,000 Canadians that will commute into Michigan every day to work. There are only 2 houses when he bought the property. That means Hiram Walker probably was the first commuter. He actually never lived in Canada. He would sail across the boat every day to run his distillery. Interestingly enough. J.P. Weiser. And if I can get the flight of whiskeys to come out shortly, that'd be great. I don't know if they're poured or not, but that'd be great. J.P. Weiser. Anybody heard of J.P. Weiser? Anybody know what JP stands for? John what? John Philip. You're probably the first person that ever got it. After John, most people say John Paul. John Paul. It's John Philip. Yeah, John Philip Weiser. He was an American. If you didn't realize, he was American. He actually lived in Ogdensburg, New York. I don't know if you know where that is. It's about an hour east of Kingston. And he was a farmer. That's what he did for a living. He was a cattle farmer. And he was ingenious in this regard. He was a smart individual. I'm a science geek. He has a journal article in the 1860s showing agriculture practices in Canada, showing what grew cattle faster than anything else was the waste from a distillery. Because we pull out all the starch in the grain, and what's left over is a high-protein feed, and JP knew that. He bought a distillery in Prescott, Ontario, which is just right across from Ogdensburg, for the purpose of growing cattle. He was the first North American to export cattle to the United Kingdom. He had over 60,000 head of cattle at one point. He was a cattle guy. That's what he wanted to do for a living. And that's what I thought JP was the ingenious part about that. I'm going to come now and push ahead to the 1860s. What grew Canadian whiskey more than anything else was the years 1861 to 1865. Not Prohibition. Does anybody know what was going on in the U.S. during the 1860s? I'll give you a hint. Abraham Lincoln. He's on the penny. The American Civil War. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? The America North is fighting the America South, correct? Where's all the U.S. distilleries located? So, yeah, you think you're fighting one another? You think you're going to be selling each other whiskey? No. And that was the biggest growth. So the Canadians took advantage of it. Hiram Walker, J.P. Weiser, Henry Corby, Gooderham and Warts. Their largest growth period was in the 1860s. Just to add to one fact about all of this, the largest distillery prior to the 1860s was in Kingston, Ontario. It was run by Thomas Molson. Thomas and his brother got into a little bit of a spat, and it was over Thomas's wife. He sold his distillery in Kingston in 1859, just prior to Civil War. Talk about timing, or I'd be up here talking about Molson whiskey today. But these guys were ingenious, creative individuals, and certainly that. So does everybody got a flight of whiskeys here? Everyone got a flight? I'll go back to my first slide, and we'll talk about Weisers Deluxe, and I'll push on in a second. So, Weisers Deluxe. If you didn't realize it, Weisers Deluxe is Canada's most popular whiskey. It should be whiskey number 1 on your flight there. They should be numbered on your glasses. It's Canada's most popular whiskey. It's what Canadians drink more than any other brand. It's traditional Canadian whiskey. It is created with double distilled corn, so making light whiskey that's aged between 5 to 9 years. The other thing, there's a little bit of rye blended into it, so if we nose the whiskey, I know these aren't great nosing cups, but if you ever get an opportunity to nose it, you'll get a little bit of a spiciness in that whiskey, and that's the rye that we do indeed blend into it. But what I really want to focus on with Weisers Deluxe is this, is it should have a dried fruit or dried raisin note into it. And the reason being is it is once used American bourbon barrels that we use for it. Anybody do any barrel aging cocktails here? You played around with it? As you would know, barrels act like a sponge, right? What was in the barrel beforehand is going to come out into your product. And we take great care in bringing in bourbon barrels, and we don't get them from one producer, we get them from many different producers because I don't want to inherit somebody's problems. It's going to have a distinctive dried fruit, dried raisin note, and it's going to be light, smooth, traditional Canadian whiskey. I want to say cheers, as I don't have a glass. Cheers, and enjoy Weisers Deluxe, glass number 1. Any comments with Weisers Deluxe? Oh, he's got a flight. Thank you, Charles. Incidentally, if you ever run whiskey tastings at all, what I would tell people, have you ever seen the whiskey glasses? Don't tell people to swirl it like wine, okay? There's enough alcohol vapor to be able to carry the flavor of the whiskey. Keep the glass still, okay? Try it. Try it. When you do a swirl, all you get is the ethanol hit. Keep the glass still. You'll certainly get the developed flavors in the whiskey. I always can tell the wine drinkers in an audience through the person that immediately does that. We don't need to do that with whiskey. Okay? And I don't really suggest water one way or another. The rule of thumb is this: if you want fruitier notes or floral notes to come out in your whiskey, add water. If you want to emphasize grain or if you want to emphasize barrel flavors, keep the strength higher. Okay? And we do that when we look at blending whiskeys. I'm going to jump ahead here because I went through that. I had a chance to meet Prime Minister Harper. Remember him? Yeah. I haven't had a chance to meet Justin Trudeau yet, but I had a chance to meet Prime Minister Harper. He actually came to Windsor to announce the new border crossing that's going to the Gordie Howe Bridge, and I had about 5 seconds with him. Unfortunately, I wanted 5 minutes with him, but he shook his hand. I said, "Mr. Harper, nice to meet you. I'm Don Livermore. I'm the master blender." "Oh, what is a master blender?" "I'm the guy that designs the whiskeys." "Oh, nice to meet you." And he moved on to the next person. But I wanted to say, no, hold on. I would love for you to take Laurier off the back of the $5 bill and put the Whiskey Barons on the back of the $5 bill, because I firmly believe that Canada was built on whiskey. Canada was built on whiskey. And that's a bold statement for me to say that. But this year, we have now hit a 100-year anniversary. You're looking at me, 100, no, it should be 150. I'm looking at a different anniversary. 100 years ago, in 1917, was the first taxation in Canada. Income tax. We've now been paying income tax for 100 years. Canada was 50 years a country before we had to pay income taxes. You know who the number 1 taxpayers in Canada was? It was Gooderham and Worts. Number 2 was Hiram Walker. Number 3 was Weiser. 4 was Corby. 5 was Seagram's. They were the 5 largest taxpayers in Canada. They paid the bills. They paid the bills. These guys were influential people in the regard that J.P. Weiser was a Liberal MP. He sat in government. Henry Corby was a Conservative MPP in the Ontario government. Gooderham and Worts was the Mayor of Toronto. Your first Rob Ford, if anybody knows who Rob Ford is. Hiram Walker, he never became Canadian, always remained American, but he was influential in political life. They built the highways, the roadways, the communities were named after it. They built the churches. That's how important they were to Canadian life. They paid the bills. So important to Canadian life is, what is the purpose of a barrel? What's the purpose of a barrel? When you sit in a whiskey tasting, you get a master blender up here telling you, we've been aging whiskey for 10 years in a barrel since 1333, following that recipe. That's BS. Why would you store something in a barrel for 10 years before you had sold it? Why would you do that? It's about profit. What if you owned your bar? Maybe you own the bar. I don't know if you're the owner or not, but what if you owned a bar? You said, you know what, we can't pour this bottle of whiskey for 10 years. We're going to keep it on the shelf. What would your boss say? You're fired. Get rid of it. You're fired. Yeah? Why would you pour something in a barrel? So if you're a pioneer in that life, you actually owned your own barrel. So you had a barrel. You'd come to the Hiram Walker distillery. You would have been filled up. You would have took it home and drank it. And would have been just aged for a matter of weeks. Whiskey would have been just aged for a matter of weeks. It's insanity to keep it in a barrel for 10 years, right? Now, one of the issues that these guys faced in that era was, well, if a pioneer had an empty barrel in that one-room log cabin, what are they going to do with it? Well, they're going to store other stuff in it, fur, fish, tea leaves, flour, gunpowder, whatever the case may be. So if you had a barrel that once had fish in it and you brought it back to the distillery, what's your next batch of whiskey going to taste like? That's where they started to burn the inside of the barrels. Lo and behold, you get the nice vanilla, caramel, toffee notes. And it was one of the issues they actually, Hiram Walker and J.P. Weisers faced, is these barrels coming back to the distillery. So we are an educated group. This is a smart audience. I really realize that. We do know whiskey has to be aged, because we all do it. Because we pick up a bottle, this is aged for this long. That's the very first quality cue we want to look at. If whiskey didn't have to be aged back in that era, the question then becomes, which whiskey category was the first one to mandate a minimum aging requirement? Which one was the first one to do it? Scotch, Irish whiskey? Who was the first one to do it? Scotch, as you think, right? I heard it. Canadian. Canadian whiskey. Go figure how innovative these guys were. Canadian whiskey was the first one to mandate a minimum aging requirement in 1890. 25 years ahead of Scotch, 25 years ahead of Irish whiskey. The government forced it on us. The only reason why I figured the government forced it on it, remember where I said the tax dollars? It was the way the government can control the flow of tax. Incidentally, one barrel of whiskey today is worth $1,000 worth of tax. That's a lot, right? So in 1889, 1 year before the law was in place, J.P. Weiser had 30,000 gallons of whiskey on hand. 1 year into the law, he had 130,000 gallons of whiskey on hand. 2 years into the law, he had 260,000 gallons of whiskey on hand. Increased his inventory by 20 times. What would your boss say if you had to increase your inventory by 20 times? You're fired. Build another warehouse. We need more storage, right? The distillers hated it. They didn't really like the rule. They did not really like the rule. They actually interviewed Hiram Walker late in his life in 1895, said, I would never start my distillery today knowing how to age whiskey. So you guys are starting to see some micro distilleries start to pop up here and there, small. What's the first thing they're doing to try to make money? What is the first thing they're making? Vodka and gin. Something white. Something white. Absolutely. How things are full circle 160 years later. But these pioneers were so ingenious that they turned a negative into a positive. If you actually look at the Globe and Mail newspaper at the early 1900s, you will actually see these guys saying, Canadian whiskies mellowed under the supervision of the Canadian government, guaranteed age of 3 years. You know what? By the year 1900, Canadian whiskey was the largest whiskey category in the world. We sold more whiskey than any other whiskey. We outsold Scotch, we outsold bourbon, we outsold Irish whiskey. It took 25 years for the other ones to catch up, just put an aging statement on theirs, to catch up to what we did. Canada, innovative. Go figure. We sell ourselves short. We should not apologize for what we're doing. So just to talk about Prohibition, because you mentioned Prohibition at the start. Prohibition was the years 1920 to 1933, where the U.S. prohibited the sale and manufacture of alcohol. So your distribution network stopped. That's not good. That's not good. It really wasn't a good time. There's some cool stories. I must admit, there's some interesting stories, but it really was not good for the distillers. So it just backed things up. So there was a few gentlemen that took an opportunity, and one of them was Harry Hatch. You've seen Harry Hatch up here for a few minutes now. Harry Hatch was a salesman from the Corby distillery. And Harry actually owned a bar in Oshawa. We got bartenders in the audience. He actually owned a bar in Oshawa, and what Harry would do is make a deal with all the fishermen that went to his bar, because Oshawa is right on Lake Ontario, and what he would do, he'd say, I'm sure he strong-armed them in a way, but he said, you know what, can you guys take this bottle of Corby whiskey with you across Lake Ontario and sell it for me? Yeah, we'll do that for you, Harry, and I'm sure they had their markups along the way. So Harry actually turned Corby into a profit while all the other distilleries went into a big decline. Harry, a smart salesman. He actually challenged a gentleman who owned Corby, was Mortimer Davis. He actually lived in Montreal here, and he actually owned Player cigarettes as well. And he said to Mortimer, he says, I know what I'm doing for you, Mortimer. I want part ownership in this distillery because I got growth. So if a salesman comes up to the owner and says that, what's the owner going to say? Go to hell, Harry. I'm not going to give you part ownership. So what's a disgruntled salesman going to do? Yeah, quit. He actually went and took out a loan, took a risk, and bought the Gooderham and Worts distillery in 1923. He actually turned it into profit while Corby actually went into decline. To make a long story short, Harry Hatch went and bought the 4 largest distilleries in Canada within a period of 8 years. Yeah, he actually went and bought Corby. He went and bought Gooderham and Worts. He bought Weisers. He went back and bought Corby. And then he actually bought the Hiram Walker distillery where I work at today for $14 million, and there's $14 million of whiskey inventory alone. The site was valued at $28 million. When 1933 approached and Prohibition ended, Harry Hatch was looking awfully pretty, and he was probably one of the top, if not the top businessman in Canada at that time. And his family maintained control of the distillery till the 1980s. And at that point, Allied Domecq bought it. Is that not a cool story? Canada was built on whiskey and on the backs of these guys, and I firmly, firmly believe that. So where do we arrive at today? So Canadian whiskey is the opposite of bourbon. Okay? It is really the opposite of bourbon. We bring in corn, rye, wheat, and barley. We process it separately. We ferment it separately. We distill it separately. We age it separately, and then we put it together at the end. I'm like you guys. I'm the guy before the bartender. Okay? So what I want to do is I look at grains for specific flavors. So if I want a sweet softness in my whiskey, I'm going to use corn. If I want a nutty character to it, I'll use barley. If I want to dial up the spiciness, I'll add rye. If I want that nice Tim Hortons character, and I don't mean Tim Hortons the coffee, I mean Tim Hortons the Timbits, the bready notes, I'll put in wheat in the recipes. I have those grains that I can play with to create styles and different aromatics inside their whiskeys. So everything's done separately, whereas bourbon puts the grains together at the start. So with that, we're going to have whiskey number 2, Gooderham and Worts. This bottle here. So Gooderham and Worts, as of 3 weeks ago, won the world's top blended whiskey by the World Whiskey Awards. And we were in competition with Irish whiskey, bourbons, and scotches. This is the world's top blended whiskey in the World Whiskey Awards. And what makes this whiskey unique here, it is 4 grains. If you ask most of the salesmen that come into your bar, they'll say, oh yeah, it's made with rye, made with corn, maybe they'll say with barley. It's hard to get 4 grains because you need the silo capacity to be able to do that and be able to process that. So this grain, it's very rare to have 4 grains in it. Okay? So this is aged in brand new virgin oak barrels, and I'm going to talk about the quality of barrels in a little while, but just pay attention, it's in brand new virgin oak barrels. What I'd like to say also on this, the strength is a little higher. Being that it's 4 grains, I thought I was trying to be a little funny. I thought, well, let's be the strength at 44.4. 44.4, Jean Bevelot, right there. If anybody likes Jean Bevelot, there you go. So it's 44.4, 4 grains, and before you taste it, it comes out in this order. You're going to get a breadiness first on the front part of your tongue. Then you're going to get nuttiness right mixed with it, so that's the wheat and the barley. About 20 seconds later, you're going to get a softness that comes across your tongue, that's the corn. And then you're going to go through, get a rye warm finish through the chest. That's what I like to call the Canadian hug. You always can tell how much rye is in your whiskey by that warm feeling that comes through the chest. Cheers to Gooderham and Worts. Bready, nutty. Right about now, I'm getting the sweet corn. Maybe through the chest. A lot of these times, it's hard to read here. A lot of these times I put on my tasting notes is the length of finish. I have here, it's about 1.5 minutes. I don't mean it's the time to finish the bottle. Okay. I mean, it's how long do you feel it after you take that sip of whiskey. And it really does indicate how much rye that we do put into the blend. What do you think of that one?
Oh, very good. It's beautiful. Well balanced.
Yeah. And the grains are not in equal proportion. It's about balancing it. Like I said, I'm the guy before the bartender. The guy before the bartender. Now, I got to look to you guys as what cocktails can you make from this? I'm not sure. Again, that's outside my area of expertise. Cinnamon. To get those nice baking notes. I can see why you would do that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Do you guys want me to dial it up a little technically here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so you can start nodding off if it gets too much, but I'll try to work my way through this. Wow. Almost looks like DNA, doesn't it? That almost does look like DNA. What I really want to try to explain to this is what makes rye exceptional. the grain rye in itself and why we do take the DNA. If you actually look, this is a plant cell and this is the grain rye. And plant kernels are made up of starch, protein, fat, fiber. And I really want to pay attention to how it actually is structured. A lot of what I want to look at is the fiber portion in the grain. So that's the husky part, okay? The husky part, that's fiber. And fiber is actually composed of a few different things. It's actually composed of three things. It's cellulose, and you can see the cellulose is the green worm-looking thing up on the screen there. And you got hemicellulose, so those are sugars, in a sense. And then what happens when you actually look at fiber? It gets wrapped up with lignin, okay? And that's the red that wraps it up. And that's what makes fiber very tough. I often will visualize a brick wall. Cellulose and hemicellulose is the bricks. Lignin is the glue. It's the cement. It holds it together. Okay, so you kind of got the sciencey part of it. Why am I focusing on that? Is rye has a high level of lignin in comparison to barley, corn, and wheat. Rye has a lot of lignin. Okay, so I've set the table for that. Why? Why is that important? That's a big slide there. A lot of chemistry going on, but you really don't have to do that. This is lignin, big-ass molecule. Big molecule, okay? That's 5,000 molecular weight. It's huge. But what we do during the fermentation and the cooking and distillation part is lignin then busts apart. Once you heat up lignin, breaks it apart, and what it does, it breaks it into those compounds there, okay? Guaiacol, creosol, 4-ethylguaiacol, eugenol, 4-ethylphenol. What drives me nuts as a blender, and I know we all do it, is the question is, how much rye is in this whiskey? The question you shouldn't be asking me is that. The question you should be asking me is how much 4-ethylguaiacol is in my whiskey. Because that's your one that gives you your sweet, spicy, smoke, clove kind of ginger perception to it. And rye has that lot of lignin, and we want to bust it apart. That's what we do during the cooking process and the distillation process. That's why we want rye in Canadian whiskey. It's the spice to your cocktails. Okay? That's my mindset and what I'm trying to target. So with that, there's our distillery today. Huge. Here's us bringing in grain here. On a given year, question?
So, just one question. What do you think about the 100% rye then that are claiming to be that 100%?
I'm going to answer your question. Be patient, and if I don't answer your question, challenge me, okay? Please challenge me. Okay, it'll come clear once we fight through this technical part, and then we'll get more fun in a second here. So in a given year, we bring in 2,500 truckloads of grain. So it's Canadian grain. It's local, okay? We love to say local in our industry, local ingredients. I must be honest with you. We bring in local because of trucking and shipping. We don't want to spend the gas bringing it up the roadway. But we do have local ingredients, and we have for 9 years. The last time we brought in some U.S. grain was about 9 years ago now. We don't guarantee it on our bottles, just in case you run into drought, that sort of thing, right? But this is our load of grain. We will test for all this stuff. Test weight, heat damage, kernel. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What we do is this. The most important test, we got a young lady that works at our grain outlet. Her name's Christy. And what Christy does when she looks at a sample of grain, the most important thing is this. She picks up the pile of grain, smells it. And what she's looking for is a musty character. It's a compound actually called geosmin. I don't know if I don't have it up on this slide. Geosmin smells like beets, like a root cell, like mama or grandma's basement. That's what it smells like. So if you ever, and the reason why I bring it, do you guys ever, if you ever have a bottle of whiskey there and you get a real musty baseball diamond dirty note, that tells you the distillery has brought in poor quality grain. Christy has the right to reject a whole entire truck of load of grain just based on her nose. It can pass all these other tests, doesn't matter. She will reject it. Don't worry, the fuel ethanol plant up the road will take that musty smelling grain. Your car doesn't care about musty smelling alcohol. Okay? The other thing is that we get is farmers can be sly, or they can be, you got to watch out for these guys, because what they'll do is they'll put the poor quality musty grain on the bottom of the trucks and they put the good stuff on the top. So you look at, that looks like a good quality grain. We actually have to probe and core the sample at various locations to make sure we get a good representative sample what they're selling to us. They do it. Farmers will do it. They'll do that sort of thing. Last thing, rye. Rye is really not growing in the Windsor area. We actually get a lot of our rye around Simcoe, Ontario, which is on the north shore of Lake Erie. And does anybody know from that area in Ontario, do you know what the major crop is there? Tobacco, yeah. I didn't do that. It's coming. It's coming. So tobacco. Tobacco needs very sandy soil to grow in. So if you look at the North Shore, it's very sandy soil. And the problem is once the tobacco is harvested, you're very prone to soil erosion for the wind. So they need to put a cover crop there in the grain. Remember when I said rye grows in poor conditions? Rye is the one crop that you can grow there to make sure the soil stays intact. So we do get a lot of our rye from the tobacco region of Canada. I always find that as an interesting story. This is our fermentation. So we have 39 fermenters that are 190,000 liters in capacity. Oh yeah, they're big. They're big. You can kind of see them here. And what we have here is corn mash. This is just to point out that we do separate our grains, rye mash. It takes about 3 days for us to ferment corn. We get up to about 15% alcohol, and we flirt with 16%, the highest of anybody in the industry. If anybody really wants to know how to ferment and you do it at home, I can tell you how you can get that high. If you really want to know. No, I didn't go do that. The rye, we don't really do a lot with. 2.5 days, we get up to about 8% alcohol on that. Likewise with the wheat and barley, we get about the same as well. So I want to say is when yeast takes the sugar that comes out of the starches and ferments it, it turns it into what? When it eats sugar, what does yeast do? Anybody ferment at home? Anybody ferment wine at home? What does yeast turn the sugar into? Alcohol, yes, and I heard the other one. Somebody said it. CO2. Alcohol and CO2. Perfect, great, good educated audience. I know no one wants to talk about yeast. Quite frankly, I don't even think most of our consumers know that yeast makes alcohol. I really don't, but I know you guys do. That is the main thing, but I want you to take away this. Yeast does this as well. Yeast makes fruity, floral, green grass, soapy, sulfur. Fruity, floral, green grass, soapy, sulfur. Those are the 5 flavor attributes that yeast will make. Has anyone had skunky beer? Skunky wine? I'm sure we've seen it before. That's the sulfur the yeast is making. And I actually know when brewers start cheating things. But we, as brewers, can change. I don't know if I put it on the next slide or not. No, I didn't. I took it out. We, as brewers, can change and influence the yeast at making those flavors. If we keep the temperature high, we make a lot of sulfur notes. If the temperature goes down, the sulfur notes and the skunky characters go away. If you actually, has anyone ever gone inside the Molson Brewery or breweries or wineries before? Have you ever gone in the fermentation cellar? It's cold, isn't it? And I actually know when they want to start speeding up the process and they start cheating, they actually bump their temperatures up and you can get skunky flavors in your beer. And actually you can see them doing that. We, as distillers, ferment very warm. So you're thinking, okay, we're making sulfur. So why? That's not a good sounding thing, right? We take that mash, we call it a corn mash, after the end of 3 days of fermentation, we put it through what we call a beer still. This is a beer still. This one happens to be 65 feet tall. It's about 9 feet in diameter, and inside at every window are trays, and you can see the tray here. Okay? So there's about 55 trays in this still that I'm showing here. So you take the mash, pour it in the top. It falls through the trays. It goes through the holes. They're about the size of a loonie. Falls all the way 65 feet to the bottom. At the bottom of this still, you add steam. The simple point is this. Alcohol's boiling point is 78 degrees Celsius. Water's 100. So all the alcohol vapor is going to go out to the top. All the dead yeast cells, the grain kernels, go out the bottom. Okay, forget all that. What you really need to know is one pass through a beer still is how bourbon distills. And this is how we distill as well. One pass through a beer still is this. You keep the grain flavor you're using. You keep the fruity, floral, green grass, soapy notes the yeast has made. Which one did I miss? Sulfur, yeah. Where does the sulfur go? Everyone says the bottom. Nope. Doesn't go out the top or you're going to have skunky whiskey. So what happens to the sulfur? Yeah, you see this? This is supposed to be nice shiny copper here. You actually see a white residue on the tray. I'm going to give you a little marketing secret. I'm going to give you a little marketing secret. Copper has the ability to salt out sulfur. All your stills have to be made from copper. Marketing guys, close your ears. We've done this for 10 centuries. All stills are made of copper. In fact, a lot of us love to put it on the back of the label, right? Copper pot distilled to copper wood, copper, copper, copper. Copper's a sexy word, right? Yeah, well, to consumers, yes. You pick it, oh, copper, it must be, yeah. I'm waiting for somebody to make it from gold still, but yeah. But copper's ability to salt out sulfur, and we need to have that in our process. That's why we can ferment for so warm, actually we'll pull out the sulfur. And we need to have that copper contact time. So we can then barrel that whiskey, or, and I'm going to answer your question right now, okay? Or we can take that whiskey, it actually comes off the still at 70% alcohol. We can then put it through a second distillation column, okay? Now remember when I said Gooderham and Worts is making double distilled smooth whiskey? We still do that today. Double distilled, we can get it up to 94.5% alcohol. I can make it from corn, wheat, rye, or barley, and you can't tell the difference. Double distillation pulls out most of the flavor. There's a brand of whiskey I compete against in Western Canada that has on their label, it says 100% rye. I don't taste any rye. I don't taste any spiciness in this whiskey. He's right. They're right. They're absolutely right. It was made from 100% rye, but they double distilled it. They stripped it out. What's the point? We're brewers as well as distillers. We know the boiling points of certain things, and it's going to really come home here in a second. Remember where we column distill it once? Keep all the flavor? Instead of putting it into a second column still, we can have the option to put it into a pot still. Pot stills are so simple. So simple. They're just like boiling soup. Very boiling soup. You put it into this pot still, slowly boils it. The very first thing that comes off is the things with the lowest boiling point. That's the green grass character the yeast has made. That's called a heads cut. We actually cut it and throw it away. Pot gets a little less. What comes out, it actually comes out in this order. I wish you have a chance to come visit me someday because I'll do this exercise for you. Charles came to visit me once we did that. What comes next is your fruity flavor, then your floral flavor, then your grain flavor. What's left in the bottom of the pot is the soapy character the yeast has made. We cut that and throw it away. So you can actually concentrate out fruity, floral, and grain character and remove green grass, soapy character by pot distillation. One other thing is if you really want to get geeky, we call this, see coming off the still, it's called a line arm. Okay, that's called a line arm. A lot of you, if you think about Scotch distilleries, a lot of the arms like this, right? This one's actually an degree down. The more you go down on a still, the heavier the whiskey becomes. If I really want to dial in the grain flavor, I want to line arm the points down. And this is how we make lot 40. I did keep this slide in here, so it really drives this point home. This chart here, if you can see it at the front here, these are all the flavors, all the chemical compounds that occurs during the whiskey process. Either comes from yeast or it comes from the grain. And the very first one, you can see in the I don't think this has a laser pointer, does it? Oh, I turned it off. There. Let's see the whole line, green grass. See the right column, green grass, fruity, floral, spicy, soapy. And those are all your boiling points, and they're all in order. Does that kind of make sense of why you pot distill? So the question you should be asking me is not how much rye is in my whiskey. And here, if you actually look at 4-ethyl glycol, here's it here. Where is the 4-ethyl glycol? Right here. You should be asking me how much is that. Next time you have your scotches, and I challenge you, single malt scotches, look for, it actually tastes like a bar soap. Has a soapy character in it? Yeah, well, I find a lot of single malts have a soapy character. It makes me wonder how long they let their pot still go on for. Is it all about money, or is that the flavor they intentionally want to put in their whiskey?
Is it?
Did that answer your question, by the way?
It did.
Yes, okay.
But the thing is, my question now is, so you double distill it, but you double distill it in two different distilleries.
What I'm saying, we actually make 3 different types of spirit. We can either single distill it, put it in a barrel. We can double distill it in 2 column stills, put it in a barrel. Or we can column distill it and pot distill it, put it into a barrel. It's my point. I have the option of the way how I can distill it.
Because most of the scotch would be in 2 pots still.
They'll just pot still after pot still after pot still. Yeah. Well, this way we can actually concentrate up the flavors even more so by column and then pot distilling it.
And is it the same for all
No,
It's not. It's just for you.
it's just what we decide to do.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah, I have a kind of a deep question about the temperature, boiling temperature of alcohol. You said that the alcohol boils at 78%.
78 degrees.
But I know that some Scotch whiskey distilleries maximize the natural filtration of the copper. They distill at a very low temperature, so the process is...
Yeah, and what you do, you can actually change boiling points whether you put the still under pressure or under a vacuum. This is what I hear. So if you actually run distillation columns here, I don't know if anyone in the room, it's against the law. But this is the atmospheric boiling point here. So you can actually change boiling points by either putting it under pressure.
Distillery can go as low as like 6 to 8 degrees.
It's the first time I actually had somebody ask that question. That's a good question. It's a very good question. Very good question. Okay, are we ready to try some whiskey? Okay, that's the most technical I'm going to get on you guys. Double Still Rye. This one actually is done quite well. Usually when we've made whiskeys and blended whiskeys at our facility over the last few years, and this is kind of answering to your question, typically when we make a whiskey, we have a double distilled whiskey with either a pot stilled rye or a column distilled, one or the other. We actually never put both of them together. And this is what it is. So this actually contains some corn, which has been double distilled through 2 column still. It contains a single column distilled rye, and it also contains a pot stilled rye in it. So it's an unusual mixture that we've never really done before, and we launched this in the last year as an opportunity to bring to the bartender as a economical version to put in your cocktails, because people want that more spicy forward whiskeys for their cocktail making, and we thought this was an opportunity to bring to the bars, to bring a high rye forward whiskey to put into your old fashions, your Manhattans. That sort of thing is what we're doing here. So this whiskey sits at 43.4, because if I'm emphasizing rye, I want the strength up a little higher. It is aged 5 to 9 years. It has a component of brand new barrels with it, once used bourbon barrels and Canadian whiskey barrels in it. So it's got 3 different types of barrels in it as well. Cheers to Double Still Rye. And you're going to get that big Canadian bear hug right now, actually, with that really warm rye feeling, certainly in that. You see what I mean? That could go to your cocktails as your spice. At this point, I usually challenge audiences, and I don't know whether I should or not with this, is do you know why they call the drinks Manhattans? That's a good question. Nobody knows? I thought somebody would know in this audience. You know what Manhattans are, I hope. Yeah. You know more than me. I got told this once, and I got suckered in it, and this is BS. This is total BS. It's called Manhattans. If you actually ever phoned Manhattan in New York, the area code is 212. 2 parts whiskey, 1 part vermouth, 2 dashes of bitters. And then I got suckered. Yeah, I got suckered, and I said, wait a minute, the drink Manhattan was made before area codes. So what are you? You are what, in the 514 area code? That sounds like a hell of a cocktail to me. One of you guys are going to come up with a 514, and I hope you're using Double Still Rye as the recipe. So I had an opportunity to do a whiskey tasting in Windsor, where I located, and the mayor was sitting right where this gentleman was. The mayor of Windsor was sitting right in that audience. He was 3 whiskeys in. He was feeling really relaxed at this point. And I declared this statement, and he shot up in his chair real quick. And I said this, is Windsor, Ontario is the most unique place in the world that makes whiskey. He shot up, and all I could see was the tourism dollar floating around his head. Well, why? Why is it the most unique place in the world that makes whiskey? It is the most unique place in the world that makes whiskey is because of our temperature change. If anyone's ever been to Windsor, it gets really, really hot there in the summer. We actually get it just as hot as bourbon country, as Louisville and Lexington. I've actually looked at the climatology data. We get just as warm. But on the flip side, in the winters, we get 20 degrees cooler in the winter. Now, that region of Ontario or that region of Canada, why do we get extreme temperature changes there? Does anyone want to venture to guess? Water, yeah. The big lake that's beside us is Lake St. Clair, and it's huge, big body of water that's only about 15 feet deep. So it heats and cools real quick. And so what happens is, why is that important? Inside of our whiskey aging warehouses, there's no electricity. You put electricity inside of a whiskey aging warehouse, it goes boom, right? Because you're prone to sparking. And what happens is when the heating and cooling, the barrels are going to be to whatever the outside temperature is. So you get this really cold environment. So you get into December, January, February, the whiskey barrels will actually drop below the freezing point of water. Likewise, in the summer, as we get into the May, April, June months, it starts heating up, and that causes a mass evaporation. We actually lose 3% of our barrel volume a year. Inside of our whiskey aging warehouses, we got 1.6 million barrels. It's the size of 132 hockey rinks. It's a lot of barrels. For us, as our employees, we cannot just walk through a whiskey aging warehouse. You'd actually start to pass out. You'd actually start to pass out. So for our employees, we actually have to open up the doors inside the big warehouses. Hopefully I can show you here in the next slide. Yeah, here they are. They actually have to open it up for an hour. They actually wear oxygen meters. That's our alarms, yeah. So if you can imagine, if there's ice cold whiskey inside the barrel, all of a sudden it's a warm day outside, you got warm air pushing through our warehouse so our people can work inside of there. What's going to happen on the outside of the barrel, especially on the metal hoops? You got cold liquid on the inside, warm air. Condensation. You get the beer bottle effect. I actually had one of Scotland's top chemists come into our warehouse and said, Don, why are all the hoops in your barrels so rusted? I've never seen that before. And that is due to our temperature change, and we really feel that adds an element of dynamic. And really what ends up happening is this. This is a little geeky here, but when barrels breathe, when oxygen hits ethanol, it turns it into ethyl acetate. It just keeps going and going and going and going in time. For us, I got 20 years of aging along the bottom. This is ethyl acetate. You don't have to remember ethyl acetate, but highly aged whiskeys will have a green apple character. Usually at this point, I will taste Weiser's 18-year, and I really invite you to try it, Weiser's 18-year, because it has a dominant green apple character, and that's an indication of age. Now, in climates that are very warm, you're going to get an intense green apple character, Jamaica, India, those sorts of places. But in Ireland or Scotland, it'll be half the level. So it will drive that green apple character. And we feel that influx of whiskey in and out of our barrels because of the natural temperature changes will bring in those extracts into our whiskey. Very, very important for highly aged whiskeys, okay? The other thing is this, and I'm going to get a little geeky as well. Barrels do the other thing is this. Barrels are made, are essentially all fiber. I'm going back to the fiber story again. Barrels are made of cellulose and hemicellulose and lignin, the brick wall analogy, okay? All right? So what we want to do as distillers is this, is we want to bust it apart. So this is lignin here. What's the best way to bust apart wood? Burn it. Absolutely. That's what the green arrow represents. You burn it. So you want to burn it to the building. If anyone can tell me how to bust apart wood better than burning it, I'm all ears. If somebody could be creative and tell me how to bust apart wood, I'd like to know. But you don't have to remember all that, but that's your flavor. If you really want to know where the vanilla notes from whiskey comes from, it comes from your lignin. And vanilla is right here. You can see it here. That's where your smoky notes, wood leather, roasted peanut. If you ever get a roasted peanut note in your whiskey, that comes from the lignin. And you want to bust it apart. The best way to bust it apart is bust it into those building blocks. I envision barrels. I'll go through this in a second. Here's your cellulose and hemicellulose busted into the building blocks, which is on the right-hand side. That's where your caramel toffee notes come from. Okay? Now, I envision barrels as, or busting apart wood is like a Jenga tower. You know what the game Jenga? You know what I mean by the game Jenga? You're busting apart, so you're taking apart the building blocks and bringing it into your whiskey. That's how I can visualize it. So, yeah, and just, well, that happens. The barrels eventually fall apart. The barrels do. We use them until they fall apart. But yeah, they will, in a sense, yeah, the game's over. You're right, the game's over when the barrel falls apart. So I'm going to challenge, I'll answer your question in a second. I'll challenge the audience as this. So I just set the stage for you that we want to burn the barrels into the building blocks. So do you think more fire is good or bad? Let's say I want to make as much vanilla caramel toffee notes as I possibly can. Do you want to burn the barrel to a thicker layer or a thinner layer? Thinner, are you sure? Is more fire good or is more fire bad?
More about the exposition of the fire, depending on how long you burn it and which temperature you burn it and everything.
Yeah. I love how you guys think. Yeah, absolutely. When I did my, I'm going to show you my PhD up here. I'm going to show you my PhD on this slide here. Well answered. This is vanilla caramel toffee along the left-hand axis. Along the bottom is 3 years of aging. The very top two lines are brand new virgin oak barrels. The blue line is a once-used bourbon barrel, and the very bottom line is a barrel that's been used over and over and over again. The top line is a barrel that's been burned for 2 millimeters. The green line, second down, is a barrel that's been burned 4 millimeters. I did it over and over and over again. You can overburn a barrel. Yeah. Overburn? You can overburn a barrel, yes. Because it turns it into just black carbon. Those previous slides I showed you here, oh, I'm losing the batteries. I should have one more arrow on the far right-hand side and just have just pure carbon. And what the pure carbon black does, all it really does, is whatever sulfur you've missed in the distillation, it'll pull it out. That's why bourbon producers will come up to you. We use a thick layer of char because they only have one opportunity for copper contact. And the only way they can pull out sulfur is by using a thick char level.
It only takes out the sulfur, doesn't impair any flavor or anything more?
Nope. The flavor is the busting it into the building blocks. You've gone too far. Yeah. There's a sweet spot on what you have to burn. I did it over and over and over again here. 2 millimeter depth of burn would give me more vanilla caramel toffee than a 4. So when we make our whiskeys, my mindset is like you guys as cocktail, is when I have a very big, bold rye whiskey, I want to maximize the vanilla caramel toffee, so we use a 2 millimeter depth of a burn in my very rye-forward whiskeys. Okay?
Is that all handmade and controlled?
Yeah, we work with partners that do it. We don't do it at our distillery. We have barrel partners that will burn it for us, yeah.
So they take down the barrel, they rebuild it, and reburn it.
Yeah, the best way you get about 80% back. So if you rebuild it, you'll get about to here. You get in about in here. Yeah, that's a great question. Good question.
What happens with indirect heating? If you want to simply cook the barrel without necessarily burning?
Toasting it?
Yeah.
Toasting it? I don't know. I never tried it. I don't know. There are sweet spots, though. If you really dig into the scientific literature, you can actually maximize your vanilla as much as possible. And that's just the next evolution of research. It's a great question. Oh, man, you guys are great questions, yeah. It's more of a subtractive reaction. You're pulling out sulfur. You pull out more sulfur, and so it's more of it might then start emphasizing other flavors. If you know what I'm saying? If you pull out more sulfur, then something else might come to the foreground, right? Yeah.
For faster aging in a barrel, as Canadian whiskey producer try wood chips as some winemaker did.
You could do wood chips, and then you can start getting more and more of this scenario. To be honest, I've never gone there because I just think the mentality is. I don't know whether I can say it. It seems like cheating a little bit.
But that's what the winemaker seems like.
Yeah. But again, things are evolving. I never say never. And the thing is, if I start buying chips and I make a recipe, then I'm held to that recipe, and I'm always held to that person that's always making the chips on me, right? So then if this brand sticks around for 60 years, you know what I'm saying? You're then held to a recipe, right?
You said that huge gain in temperature that experimental experiments change the aging of the whiskey. Are you going to provide days of this fact? Or?
You got to say that one more time. I just heard that dishes.
Okay, you said that the huge difference in temperature that Canada experiments change the aging of the whiskey. You're going to go back on the details?
Yeah, no, what the temperature will change is that green apple, the ethyl acetate.
Okay.
It doesn't change this fact.
The compound that's going to be affected by that.
Yeah.
Okay. Like actually the aging that you don't like shorten it or lengthen it because of it.
That's what they call as the point of maturity. I actually should on this graph have my acetate graph along with a barrel, and we call it what point is the whiskey then mature. Yeah, that's why I always say, is age statements really important? It is if you're looking for a green apple flavor, but certainly a quality of the barrel is going to certainly change what you're doing. Incidentally, the very bottom line, if you really want to know, and I'm going to answer kind of your question, it was kind of funny when you answered, that purple line, even if I use the barrels 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, it will always give me the same result. Because alcohol in itself is a very good solvent. It just keeps breaking apart the barrel, just keeps breaking it apart, just keeps breaking it apart, until it falls apart.
So, just to get it right, because I think I got a bit confused here. You said that the aging process, the only thing it does is
So I just heard
it just impairs more apple flavor?
That's the oxidation reaction. There's 4 things in a barrel. You get oxidation reaction, that's a green apple. You get extractions here. Okay, that's an extraction reaction. Yeah, and then you got a subtractive reaction, which pulls out your sulfur, and then you get color. There's 4 reactions in a barrel. You get the oxidation, which is the green apple. You get extraction, which is this graph. Those are your wood sugars. Then you get subtractive reactions with the black carbon. It pulls out sulfur. And then you get color forming in your whiskey. Those are the 4 reactions in a barrel. There's 4 things that happen. That's why it's a state of maturity, not a state of age.
Does this chart apply to any type of wood? Or?
No, this is white oak here.
Oh, okay, that's just white oak.
This is white oak, yep. Yeah, I never tried it with the other wood, but that somebody else can do it. I only had so much to do on my PhD. Yeah. But do you follow what I'm saying? The bottom line, even if you use the barrel 3, 4, 5 times, you're always going to get the same amount of wood extracts coming out because alcohol will keep pulling out the building blocks. We'll keep doing it.
Why do they sell it? Why do they get rid of this now?
We don't.
Oh, you don't?
Nope. Nope. Nope, we just downgraded to different brands. Yeah.
Do you reburn actually the cap?
That's what he was asking. Yeah, you can reburn it, but you have to scrape the char level off before you burn it again. And then that's where you can get to about 80%. You can get up to about here. About here. Yeah. Okay. Man, this is great questions. So, finally get there. Lot 40. This is the bartender's dream. This is 100% rye. So we column and pot distill it, so we concentrated up that 4-ethyl glycol. We've aged it in brand new virgin oak barrels. Right now we're about a 7 or 8 year age on that one. Again, age is a matter of, it's about maturity more than anything. This is 100% rye, very intense, great for cocktailing, 43% alcohol. I just absolutely love this whiskey. We're not going to get any more intense whiskey in our distillery than this brand here. Cheers. Wow. Certainly get the fruity floral notes. I really get a floral note on Lot 40 myself. What do you guys think? Have you guys used Lot 40 in your cocktails at all?
Why do you say you wouldn't get any other
More intense? I said at our distillery we don't make it any more concentrated rye flavor than this one here.
Okay, that's the most concentrated flavor you get.
Yeah. If you actually start concentrating up rye, then you start losing yield, and then what are you in business for, right? You start taking less and less heads and tails cuts, right? It's not to say we won't do it someday, but currently we don't. Good question. Real good question. Yummy? Have you guys tried Lot 40 before? Most people have? Yeah. Sounds like it's a staple maybe around your place. And I think it might be appropriate now. The cocktail, I don't even know what the cocktail that's being served. Lot 40 Manhattan. So well, cheers to that too. 212 right there. Yummy. What bitters do you guys like to use in your Manhattans? Orange. I've heard orange.
I really like Bob's Abbott's bitters in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Really killed it.
Really kill it, yeah. I've been playing with making some bitters myself. I know you guys probably do the similar kind of things. I actually made one from what we call this Canadian snake root, which is awesome. It's actually, they actually term snake root the ginger of the north. It's actually very, very, it's grown in a lot of in Western Canada actually. But yeah, I've been playing with bitters and I'm always curious on it. All right, While you guys are saying this, I've made a couple of mistakes in my life. This really silences the audiences when I say this. I made a couple of mistakes in my life. One of them, I was in Winnipeg in February. He's been there then. We get the one person in the audience. He got it. Have you been in Winnipeg in February? How was it? When Fahrenheit meets Celsius, it's damn cold. Yeah. And the reason why I was in Winnipeg in February is that's when Winnipeggers have their annual whiskey fest. They have nothing better to do in February than drink whiskey. So I was out there in February doing the whiskey fest, and I got asked to go on breakfast television. Do you have breakfast television in Montreal? Yeah, breakfast television. I got asked to go on breakfast television following the whiskey fest, 6:45 in the morning. Mistake number 2. Okay, I can do interviews. I want to be able to do interviews and public relations, so I can do it. What questions are they going to ask me on breakfast television? Can't be all that challenging. And I know we have some Jameson and Glenlivet ambassadors in the audience. I actually got on in the audience with Keith Trussler, the Glenlivet ambassador, and at the time the Jameson ambassador. He's no longer with us, but he was in the audience. He was on TV with me. 6:45 in the morning, 4 minutes, and I got asked this question. And I was the first one to be asked, is what makes Canadian whiskey better than Scotch or Irish whiskey?
Good morning.
Good morning. And he wanted banter. He wanted friendly banter. But you don't ask blenders. We don't ask whiskey producers that. How do you answer that question? Because they're all good. They're all good. But I turned my foggy head into, it was my aha moment. And actually, and I still remember, it was my aha moment. And this is how I answered the question. Is I believe Canadian whiskey is the most innovative, creative whiskey category there is. All we have to be is 40% alcohol, fermented, aged, and distilled in Canada, aged in a wooden barrel. We just say wooden, doesn't matter what type of wood, wooden barrel of 700 liters of less than 3 years and made of grain. That's it. They don't tell me on the grain or a mash bill or percentages. They don't tell me how to distill it. They don't tell me the barrel type. I can change all those different things and I can make completely different flavors in the whiskey. And I truly believe that Canadian whiskey is diverse, and that's what represents Canada as a nation. The original whiskey distillers set up a rule and regulations for us to create different Don't you guys want to be creative? You're bartenders. I want to be creative in making the whiskeys that I do. And I truly believe that. The poor guy from the Jameson, I don't know what the Jameson ambassador, I can't see where you're, yeah. The poor guy didn't know how to answer it. Poor Keith, how do you answer that question? But that's what I believe Canadian whiskey is. And I think we should be proud. We should stop apologizing for Canadian whiskey as Canadians. We got to stop doing it. We do make great quality stuff. For example, Goodham and Warts was the top blended whiskey in the world. We got to stop doing it to ourselves. We do make good quality stuff. Yeah.
Let go of rules, like for example, Irish whiskey, let go of the Scotch.
I think the rules should stay in place. I think there's enough there to protect the consumer, but
On the side, do you think that all the countries should...
Oh, do you think they should lighten? No, I don't think. I think that's their style. I think Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey and bourbon should maintain the rules, because you know a bourbon when you pick it up. I think Canada represents our culture and diversity and what we can do in our whiskeys. I think it is what Canada is. I think the rules are great and for everybody. I think what they are, to protect the consumer. I really believe that. Last thing, and while finishing it up here. So there was one person here doing some barrel finishing, and somebody else kind of playing with it. Do you really want to know what barrel finishing is, the science word for it? It's actually called diffusion. Diffusion. Molecules by nature want to go to equilibrium. They want to be equal. So let's say this is the inside of a barrel. Let's say this is a wine barrel. It'll come out into the whiskey, which is blue, until it's equilibrium. It takes about 60 days to do. Only 60 days. Anything past that, you're doing any aging mechanism after that.
So it's just the the oxidation.
Oxidation, extraction, subtraction. It takes 60 days for it. So that's the wonderful thing about we can finish barrels in Canada. You can use a port barrel, which give you a wine finish. You can do, I mean, the war is your cognac, bourbon barrels, and you bring in all these different flavors. And it's a technique that we certainly do. And I'm going to say it on this last whiskey here. I just got to double check which one it is. This last whiskey we're going to try today is actually called Pike Creek. This is where we took, after 10 years of aging, we took a double distilled spirit, light Canadian whiskey, took it out of the barrel, we put it into a cask that once contained Caribbean rum. So the expectation is if you got Caribbean rum in your barrel, you're going to get nice brown sugars. In fact, this one I get a little bit of a smoky molasses nuance to it. This has very little rye in it, so you're not going to get the big Canadian hug. This is all about that mouthfeel, the brown sugar notes. Certainly can bring it into your cocktails if you really want that brown sugar style of whiskey. And this brand is called Pike Creek. Cheers, and thank you guys for being in my audience today.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
That is a nice molasses feel. It does remind you of rum in a sense, but it makes sense if you're doing that barrel diffusion, barrel finishing step. Wonderful, isn't it? Yummy. I've probably gone past time. I'm sure I have. I didn't keep track of time. Charles, well, how are we are for time? We're right on time. Do you got time for one question, or do you want to? Has anybody got a pressing question after everything we saw here? I answered all your questions about whiskey. Not really. I just made it more confusing, haven't I? You know what? Take away something. Take away something. I'm sure there's something between the history and how Canadian whiskey is made. And again, I think, again, to reemphasize, let's be proud of what we do in Canada, and let's stop apologizing. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.